JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, penned by Hirohiko Araki, is one of the most popular manga on the face of the earth, with a ludicrously popular anime to its credit. However, this story and I have a short but complicated history. Unlike the blind One Piece review series I created in 2020, this review is coming not from a place of enthusiasm, but one instead of hopeful curiosity. You see, way back when this show initially grabbed the world by the scruff of its neck and whispered lovingly into its ear, "This is my swamp," I too, along with I assume many of you, decided to see what all the hype surrounding this show was about. And in my mind, I was prepared for a narrative masterpiece rivaled only by few, with music and animation the likes of which I had never seen before. Such were my naive, unjustified expectations going into this bizarre adventure. Needless to say, I gave up towards the beginning of part 3, but not before forcing myself to get to that point. So why am I giving this series another shot, you might be asking? Hope is, now that I have my expectations in check and I know what to expect, I'll be able to really get into this series and, spoiler alert, I think it worked. I'm totally not Mark, and this is my review for one of the most bonkers, brash, bombastic, and bizarre arcs I have ever had the pleasure to read through. This is part 1 to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Phantom Blood. Over the last week, I posted 2 polls onto my Twitter at TotallyNotMark, asking my audience how much of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure's manga have you read, and the other asking the same question regarding the anime. The results were interesting, with the vast majority of people having seen all parts available in the anime, and significantly more not having read the manga. And I view this as interesting because, ever since I mentioned in my last video that I was going to be commencing my JoJo series this week, I've been inundated with countless tweets ranging from polite suggestions to full-on demands that I watch the anime for the purpose of this review. And to that I say, politely, no. Firstly, as I've mentioned, I've already been exposed to the anime for the first 2 parts of the story and couldn't really get into it. Secondly, as a reviewer, manga is my preferred medium of choice to consume story in. This is to help me get as close as possible to the writer's vision of the story without any compromise. I want to review Araki, the writer of JoJo, and not some studio writer or animator paid to interpret his work. What? Besides, plenty have already reviewed the anime, with few reviewing the manga. And let me tell you, my experience with the manga of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure was vastly different to my experience with the anime.
Explain yourself.
Despite having technically seen the first 2 parts in full, I couldn't really remember much about them at all beyond the main characters' names and some really vague plot points dotted here and there. And this, part 1, Phantom Blood, I was particularly fuzzy on, as I personally found it to be, at first, the least interesting and, at times, boring. And I have no idea what I was thinking, because boring is not a word I would dare use to describe Phantom Blood now. With that said, having only seen it in the anime prior, I was quite excited and optimistic to check this out in my format of choice, manga. Wait, what? The anime only had like 8 episodes. How is there this much material to get through for part 1? Alright, look, this looks like a lot, but if I'm being honest, now having gone through it, while it seemed long at first, it actually turned out to be, specifically from volume 2 onwards, surprisingly well paneled and paced. In other words, Phantom Blood was surprisingly fun. The slowest part being its first volume covering the backstories of the 2 main characters, or at least it was initially. However, when I understood what it was trying to do in volume 1, I managed to get into it a lot more easily. However, something I have to say right off the bat regarding the story is that Bizarre doesn't even begin to scratch the surface when it comes to describing what this story is. The way it's told is honestly baffling, not necessarily from a narrative perspective, though I have a lot to discuss there too, but really more than anything else, how these characters behave and command the pages of this comic feel as though they were written and drawn by an alien that thinks it knows how humans talk and what they look like, in some cases. Despite this, however, even early on in the story, there's a clear attention to detail that's present not only with the characters' expressions, but also some of the backgrounds. God, these just make me tired to look at sometimes. I mentioned the visuals of this manga partially because one of the few aspects that contributed to my negative experience with the anime was how little the characters actually moved. I go into an anime to see an animated story. I pick up a manga to read through the panels of a story, and for me, this go around, I think the manga did a much better service to the story being told here. So let's get to the story. The main characters. The narrative itself tells the story of the upbringing and ultimate conflict between two characters, Dio Brando, the antagonist, and Jonathan Joestar, the protagonist, otherwise known as JoJo. And something I found really interesting right off the bat was how this story was structured in addition to the choices made by Araki in telling this story. While there are what I would call narrative flubs dotted throughout this otherwise simple story, it's worth noting that it's actually a little more unconventional and, dare I say, sophisticated than first impressions might convince you of it being. Lord Joestar, JoJo's father, takes Dio in as his adopted son after his father passes away due to complications with his health, in order to repay a debt he owed him. Immediately it becomes evident that Dio has clear and malicious motives to gain control of the Joestar fortune in order to prove his worth, and he will do absolutely anything to ensure his goals are met in this story. He does some truly horrific things, from kicking JoJo's dog Danny to manipulating his friends and family and ruining his relationship with his first love, but few instances match up to the utter cruelty in this section that presents itself when Dio burns JoJo's dog to death. It's an horrific scene and one this manga really marinates in. There are a number of scenes in this part where the gruesome nature of the story is really on full display, with some instances leaning pretty far into the horror side of the genre. There's a series of conflicts throughout the years that build and build and build, leading to the death of JoJo's father and his ultimate life falling into ruin until the final battle between JoJo and Dio, which feels fittingly massive in both scope and consequence. And that's more or less the plot, but what really interested me early on was how Araki ultimately chose to tell this story. You see, with a manga by the name of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this story would very much follow the adventures of JoJo. And while this is partially true, interestingly, this story is split right down the middle, with the first half focusing on the journey of Dio, and the second, as a result of that first journey, Jonathan's, which makes Jonathan in this first half a supporting character to Dio.
I'm a what?
A supporting character.
Now, one issue many might have with this story early on, I think quite understandably by the way, is that of Jonathan's personality and overall character. While his opening scene is quite strong in establishing his virtuous good guy persona, his dialogue and subsequent scenes thereafter feel less heroic and more so a naive, overly dramatic child, which he again quite understandably is, but normally in these types of stories we begin by following the hero on a journey of self-discovery and struggle in order to achieve his or her goals. However, in the first half of this story, Jonathan is 100% reactionary, doesn't necessarily have a goal, and to be perfectly honest, is sort of a goody two-shoes, which, unless the character has agency over the plot, can eventually come off as boring. In the first half, he doesn't even really feel like a main character to me, and in part, I think that's because the real main character of the first half is Dio Brando. There exists a well-known story writing concept called the hero's journey, popularized by Joseph Campbell in his 1949 book entitled The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and in this book he describes that narrative pattern as follows. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered and decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow men. And the degree to which Dio fits into this mold is too perfect to be coincidental. And what's more is that throughout the course of this first half of the story, up to its climax, Dio the character gives Jonathan Joestar, the titular character JoJo, the narrative circumstances to not only be the main character of the story, but this time to be compelling, complete with new motivations and a virtuous agency that guides the plot into finishing its second and third acts. And while I'm drawing attention to this second half, you'll also notice that during these sections, Dio's contributions to the story suddenly shift from being the instigator to being more reactionary and losing agency as a result. He is no longer the driving force of the plot. He's long since completed his hero's journey, and now JoJo is the main character of the tale leading into the big finish. And I love that aspect of the story. For me, this is what helped the pacing during the midsection that all too often stories get lost in. In Phantom Blood's midsection, we have the climax to Dio's journey, and we also get the beginning of JoJo's. And I thought that was a really clever idea. From the moment this story kicks off, we're introduced to the circumstances Dio has been living in with his father, along with an immediate call to action. He accepts the call and in doing so casts himself into a new world unlike anything he's seen before. It's very easy to see, at least from the surface, that Araki is trying to portray Dio as an outright villain, unapologetic dogmatic in his approach to the world and those around him. Essentially, Araki wants no one to like Dio in this story. I mean, he beats and burns a dog to death, what more do you need? However, over the course of these opening chapters, we gain a host of interesting and perhaps contradictory insights into the psyche of Dio. Clearly resentful of his father, Dio is terrified that he will end up like him, a scumbag drunk unable to take care of himself or his family. And what I found particularly interesting were the moments Dio would start to remind himself of his father, how much that would disgust him and what that might mean for him going forward in his life. He might not be able to escape who he is, and this acts as a clear motivator for him to change his circumstances and to, at all costs, avoid becoming who his father was, which just so happened to be accepting the powers of a mask and becoming a vampire overlord. What's more is, albeit brief, there are one or two instances in the story where we really get a glimpse into what the primary reasons behind his father's resentments might be. He blames him for his mother's death. This was really interesting to me, as throughout the story, Dio is painted as one of the most sadistic characters, with the only fondness he'd ever project existing for the sole purpose of manipulating others. But this, and I can't believe I'm saying this about JoJo, is actually a really good example of subtle storytelling that adds more depth to a character. The drawback, however, if you can call it that, to having a villain take up so much of your story, specifically early on with almost all of the agency, is that they become much more interesting than the hero of the narrative. While Jonathan does improve dramatically, in my opinion, after the halfway point, receiving a fantastic motivation in avenging his father and protecting the world from Dio, he is, from that point on, always playing catch-up with the Dio character as a result. And with the way Dio is framed from the halfway point onward as this demonic vampire zombie overlord Jonathan needs to overcome, it's really difficult to beat his cool factor also, resulting in, for me at least, Dio writing his name all over this part. And so, while Phantom Blood spends an equal amount of time with both characters overall establishing and resolving their heroes' journeys, after the dust settled, I found myself thinking of Dio and not Jonathan when writing about this story. In other words, Jonathan becomes an entertaining result of the world Dio created for himself.
The second half.
With that said, regarding Jonathan specifically, because his character really blossoms in the second half, I'll give my final thoughts on him towards the end. Because if there's one thing I want to make clear with this video, it's that before I gave JoJo a second chance, I was very wrong about Jonathan Joestar as a character. And I'll explain more clearly in a moment. But before that, let's discuss the second half in more detail. Because holy hell, does this get really good, really fast. With my introspective reflection on the material contained in Volume 1 and early Volume 2, I was able to see and appreciate what Araki was trying to do. But once the second half of the story came around, it's like everything started to fall into place for me. Whether that was a consequence of the prior build-up in Volume 1 or the vast improvements in layouts and artwork, I fell hook, line, and sinker for the material contained in this section, which is honestly, in almost every sense of the word, fantastic. The second half details the events that unfold after the Burning Mansion fight between Dio and JoJo, which, by the way, it was awesome, with a capital A. This was the very first scene and action sequence that actually grabbed me and said, "This is my swamp." Now, this clearly isn't perfect by any means, with the side characters predominantly letting the side down when it comes to contributing to various sequences, most notably Jonathan's father, who, in all honesty, is one of the worst realized characters both in anime and manga, and maybe even fiction for me. He is not a character, he is a plot device. He has no relationship with his son besides not believing in him, for honestly preposterous reasons, and we only know that they love each other because we are told that they do. This annoys me only because he is the driving force behind Jonathan's motivation in this second half after he dies. But honestly, that's as bad as it gets for me, or, well, it's one of the low points for sure. However, outside of that, the spectacle that is the Burning Mansion showdown between a newly vampiric demon overlord Dio and a highly motivated Jonathan is fantastically framed, and when placed alongside everything that came before, honestly feels fittingly massive in scope and consequence. I'm telling you, as soon as Dio chopped off that policeman's head, my jaw hit the floor. And this is as good a place as any to draw attention to this, but the manga version of this story is way more awesome visually in my opinion. While the animation for the anime was standard, I guess, some of these drawings in these second half panels are honestly stunning, and not to mention easy to read through without much effort at all. And did I mention the gore? Oh my god, the gore! Remember in the anime when Dio burned the dog to death? Well, you actually get to see the dog burned to death in the manga. Remember when Dio makes a mother eat her own child? Yes, that actually happens. Dio just goes yeetus fetus and boom, she starts ripping her son apart. In the anime, it cuts away and all you see is her shadow doing the deed. But in the manga you see this. I can't stress this enough, but the battles and poses and gruesome antics that take place during this second half are more than worth the price of admission, and my god, did they suck me into this story in ways the anime never did before. So once Dio goes bye-bye, but not really, Jonathan then goes on a quest to end Dio's reign of terror, to stop him taking over the world with zombie vampire monsters, to avenge his father, and to learn breath fighting from JoJo's resident Wim Hof, Zeppeli, a character I am convinced exists, at least partially, to give Jonathan another father figure, a real father figure, to fight for once he eventually dies. Spoilers, by the way. I should also mention at this point, because I feel like people will get mad if I don't, but Speedwagon is here too, I guess. He's initially a mugger that Jonathan beats the bejesus out of, inspires, and then immediately becomes lifelong friends with. Narratively, he serves honestly no other purpose than to facilitate some comedy, to act as the official commentator for the entire second half, and to remind us of Jonathan Joestar's exact height and weight down to the centimeter. I have no idea why this is important, but he makes sure to remind us whenever we need it. But this section where Zeppeli comes out of nowhere and acts as Jono's Yoda mentor is actually pretty fun. It's a standard training arc that introduces us to this universe's magic system known as Hamon, and he punches a frog, which, funnily enough, is actually a really important aspect to the story. I like this system, but I think the best place to talk about it is during the fight scenes that present themselves as JoJo, Speedwagon, and Zeppeli make their way to confront Dio.
The fight scenes.
This part honestly has some brilliant fight choreography, and it's here Araki's writing and creativity come to life in a way that's more proficient than I honestly was expecting. Though I did have moments where I was left scratching my head or a little disappointed. However, I will say that for the vast majority of these instances, not only do these fight scenes hold up after 30 years, but they really capture a unique tone in this shonen unlike any I've seen. There's a level of gruesome agony to a lot of his work in addition to moments of classic hero versus villain stuff, but more often than not, Araki likes to make you expect something, for you to anticipate a plotline to go one way and then completely subvert your expectations before then leaning into a more traditional conclusion that feels earned while also creating a nice contrast with what came before. But enough blustering. Let's tackle these fights.
JoJo versus Jack the Ripper.
While a conventional coming-of-age training fight, Zeppeli and Jonathan's outing against literally a zombie vampire version of Jack the Ripper was very enjoyable. It's a great training scene that exposes to us, the viewer, a lot of new idiosyncrasies for the Hamon power system we were initially introduced to earlier in the story. And Jack explodes out of a horse too.
How?
If I think back to my very first time watching this series in the anime, one aspect of the show that I distinctly remember disliking or finding boring was that of the Hamon power system. And while I still recognize a number of clear examples that I disliked regarding said system, for the most part I think my initial perception of Hamon was ill-founded. Disconnecting your own bones to reach farther, walking on water, and punching through objects are just a small number of the abilities you stand to gain when you harness this breathing technique. It's all pretty insane to look at, and from a visual medium, that's exactly what you want from a technique. However, despite my initial impression of Hamon being misguided, I'm still not sure if I actually like Hamon or not within Phantom Blood. On one hand, I like magic or power systems in these sorts of stories that have a particular focus on battles or fight scenes. Usually these systems offer a lot in the way of variety, suspense, and visual spectacle, but in one moment I will really like what Araki has chosen to do here in foreshadowing possibilities with the technique, and on the other hand,
Surprise lead hang glider.
let's talk about Tarukas and Blueford's fight.
Jonathan Joestar, Zeppeli, and Speedwagon versus Tarkus and Blueford.
It's around this time you should start thinking about these fights as dungeons before the big boss that is Dio at the very end. Again, it's a simple concept, and Araki makes full use of these characters to communicate their personas even more. I've already discussed the familial cannibalism, but there's also this section where Dio resurrects some undead knights to fight on his behalf. Tarukas and Blueford, with the clear highlight for me being JoJo's altercation with Blueford. While Zeppeli is out of commission, Jonathan is forced to act on his own against easily his biggest obstacle yet. Now, there are aspects to storytelling that I love, and over the years I've gotten pretty decent at picking up the literary breadcrumbs to see what the writer is thinking and where the story might be going. I mentioned liking Zeppeli punching the frog, demonstrating pretty succinctly to JoJo what Hamon was capable of. I liked this because it acted as a subtle piece of foreshadowing much later in the story as JoJo takes out Jack the Ripper with that exact same principle. Catching, I assume, some of us off guard because since we've been exposed to that ability at the very beginning with Zeppeli, we've seen and learned so much more about Hamon, and as a result that might not have come to our mind or the forefront of our minds despite it technically being a known option or mechanic within the technique. And it's that narrative sleight of hand I'm personally a big fan of, explaining how something works and then implementing those rules in interesting and compelling ways. The best example I can think of for this sleight of hand within the series can be seen in JoJo's battle with Blueford when he falls into the water fighting him. At this point in the story, Hamon is a fundamental part of how battles work and pretty much everything revolves around it. But as he's fighting underwater, he realizes that he can't use his Hamon. Why? Because he can't breathe underwater. It's a breathing technique, and that makes complete sense. Again, it's a really nice narrative demonstration of Araki's chops, especially so early in the series. Taking something once thought to be completely understood and then, through creativity, outwits the audience watching by doing something seldom thought of but still feasible. However, ironically, this fight, after JoJo liberates Blueford from the spell of Dio, also has an example of him breaking the Hamon power system in two. Nothing we know about Hamon suggests that this was possible. This was the instance for me where Hamon crossed the threshold from power system to plot device. In this moment, Araki needed a way for the crew to escape out of this dire situation he's created against Tarukas and couldn't think of anything, so whoop!
Surprise leave hang glider.
But who cares? Kid crawls in a hole, Tarukas crushes two men into soup with his bare hands, and Zeppeli dies. It's pretty sad. Okay, jokes aside, I call this Jonathan's real father's death scene because unlike Lord Joestar, we as an audience actually get to see Jonathan form a relationship with this character, fostering new talent and go through hardships with him. And in a blaze of glory, Zeppeli gives up his life to inspire Jonathan and to infuse all of his life force and Hamon into Jonathan's body, making Jonathan super buff and shirtless now. Anyways, now filled with genuine purpose and a new posse of randos for some reason. Well, okay, they're not technically randos, but they definitely came out of nowhere. With all of this now filling the sails of Jonathan Joestar, he finally starts to feel like the hero of the story and one that rivals the level of his adopted brother and now Lord of the Underworld, Dio.
Dio Brando versus Jonathan Joestar.
This fight, in theory, has two sections that honestly ends on one emotional note, the likes of which I knew was coming but had no idea would hit me or affect me as much as it did. Leading up to and during this fight that takes place in Dio's castle, the panel work and overall art direction is spectacular from top to bottom. I've heard a lot of people say that this manga has aged poorly, but for the life of me, I can't see it. As someone that has made a lot of videos discussing and criticizing the panel work of other mangakas that are equally, if not more prolific, I can say without an ounce of uncertainty that I have enjoyed the paneling in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure more than quite a lot of extremely popular manga out there, sporting a fantastic vintage aesthetic while also delivering upon some visually stunning spreads and action sequences that rival some stuff from Dragon Ball's manga, which I consider to be of extremely high standard. Now, I liked the fight between Dio and Jonathan, but it honestly goes by faster than I thought it would, with Dio losing his head and the fight coming to an end quickly thereafter. Now, this isn't to say that I thought it was bad or anything, far from it. I actually really liked it, but compared to the fight against the two nights prior, I was expecting something more. And boy, did we get more. Out of the wreckage of this fight, the weird, creepy follower of Dio that I totally forgot to tell you guys about picks up his head and runs off into the night. Time passes and we see JoJo get married to his childhood sweetheart, and on this ship they travel and we get some truly touching layouts and exchanges between the two characters, recalling when they first met all those years ago. And for a character we barely see in this arc, this is a really nice and sweet scene that, all things considered, should have landed pretty flat, but it didn't. And then, boom! Dio head and creepy guy come out of the shadows, with Dio finally revealing that he truly respects Jonathan now, which is honestly a really nice moment, not only for Dio's character, but their relationship as a whole. Because of this, Dio now wants Jonathan's body to be his own. He won't accept anyone else's. Destruction ensues, and in the chaos, Jonathan is forced to sacrifice himself to save his newborn daughter and his wife. And that aspect of the story is what took me by surprise. I've spoken at length about the traditional nature of this story and how, at times, it does quite well subvert in order to bring on a surprise. But to kill off your main character at the end of this arc is honestly an incredible move that, had I not seen the anime, I would never have seen this one coming. The closing moments of this arc as the two lovers share and exchange pleasantries with each other for the last time are honestly touching, and thus is the conclusion to Phantom Blood. Now that I've finished all 3 volumes of Phantom Blood, I must say that while lacking in subtlety within many plot points, despite having a bad experience through the anime all those years ago, I can't say I didn't thoroughly enjoy myself this time around. Compared to my experience day one, this arc, that gets a lot of criticism from the public, that I totally thought I would join in with by the way, has honestly surprised me with the level of polish and clear passion that has gone into making it. Now, it's certainly not without its problems, many of which I've shared with you today. They all exist, but my experience, at least with the manga of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, has shown me a beautifully paneled, subtly sophisticated, and exciting story that oozes with love, style, and personality that only a mangaka like Araki could ever hope to realize on the page. There are so many things about this story that are wrong that really, when all added together, shouldn't work. But somehow, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure manages to pull it out of the bag and not only delivers, but delivers in an emphatic and unapologetically quirky, bizarre way, and I loved it. However, if you thought this video of Phantom Blood was entertaining or enlightening, Part 2, Battle Tendency, is a complete and total... Thank you guys for watching the first episode of my revisit into the wild and surprisingly enjoyable world of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. When I did watch this series years back, Joeseph was a highlight for me then, so I can only imagine how much I'm going to enjoy him this time around. Wish me luck, and I'll see you all next week when I tackle JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 2, Battle Tendency. As always, I've been Totally Not Mark, and thank you so much for watching.